My name is Ethan, and at 21, I had already learned how easy it was to look stable while quietly unraveling. On the surface, my life moved in predictable lines: classes in the morning, part-time work in the afternoon, evenings split between study and the comfort of routine. Mark, my boyfriend of nearly 2 years, fit neatly into that rhythm. He was dependable, thoughtful, and certain about us in a way I once found reassuring. Lately, though, certainty felt heavy. Mark and I shared an apartment just off campus. We shared groceries, a calendar taped to the fridge, and a habit of speaking in logistics rather than feelings. Our conversations had slowly shifted from "how are you" to "did you remember?" I didn't doubt his affection. I doubted whether affection alone could carry the weight of everything we were no longer saying. I told myself this was normal. Relationships matured. Passion softened into something quieter. That was what people said when they wanted to believe comfort was enough. Then there was Lucas. He sat 3 rows ahead of me in comparative literature, always arriving exactly on time, never early, never late. He had a way of listening that made professors linger and classmates over-explain themselves. We weren't friends, not really, but proximity has its own language. A shared glance when a lecture dragged. A half smile when the projector malfunctioned. Small acknowledgements that felt larger than they should have. The first time we spoke properly was over something insignificant. I dropped my pen, and he picked it up before it hit the floor. "You look like someone who overthinks commas," he said, handing it back. I laughed, surprised. "Only when they matter." "They always matter," he replied, smiling like he meant more than punctuation. That should have been the end of it. A harmless exchange, filed away and forgotten. Instead, it stayed with me, resurfacing at odd moments, while brushing my teeth, while waiting for Mark to come home, while pretending to listen to lectures I had already read. I noticed things after that. The way Lucas avoided his phone during class. The faint crease between his brows when he concentrated. The fact that he never talked about dating, even when everyone else did. None of this meant anything on its own. Together, it formed a quiet curiosity I refused to name. Mark noticed my distraction before I did. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said one night, not accusing, just observant. "I'm tired," I answered too quickly. He nodded, accepting the explanation because love sometimes chooses ease over interrogation. The guilt that followed surprised me with its intensity. I hadn't done anything wrong, at least, not yet, but something had shifted. I could feel it in the way my thoughts wandered, in how silence between Mark and me no longer felt restful. Days passed. The semester pressed forward. Lucas and I exchanged occasional comments after class, nothing personal, nothing risky. Still, every interaction carried an undercurrent I pretended not to recognize. It wasn't desire, not exactly. It was possibility, which felt more dangerous. One afternoon, after a long lecture and a longer internal debate, I stayed behind while the classroom emptied. Lucas lingered too, pretending to reorganize his bag. "You heading to the library?" he asked casually. "In a minute," I said. He nodded. Same. The hallway outside was unusually quiet, most students already gone for the day. As we walked, the air felt charged in a way I couldn't explain. Not tense, anticipatory. We reached the intersection where our paths usually split. Instead of turning, Lucas paused. "I'll catch up later," he said, eyes meeting mine just a second too long. I watched him disappear down the corridor, my chest tight for reasons that had nothing to do with exhaustion. I stood there longer than necessary, aware that something ordinary had begun to tilt into unfamiliar territory. Eventually, I headed toward the campus building near the old lecture halls, telling myself I needed a moment alone. I didn't know why my steps slowed as I approached, only that some instinct urged caution while another urged curiosity. I took a breath, pushed the door open, and crossed a threshold that felt far more significant than it should have. The campus building was nearly empty, its silence broken only by the distant hum of ventilation and my own footsteps echoing too loudly. I told myself I was just seeking a quiet place to think, somewhere neutral where I could untangle the restlessness that had followed me all day. The logic sounded thin even to me. The bathroom lights flickered once as I entered, settling into a dull, steady glow. I splashed water on my face, staring at my reflection as if it might explain what I was feeling. The person looking back seemed composed, but his eyes carried a question he wasn't ready to ask. I heard the door open behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Lucas. some awareness sharpened instantly, like a room-changing temperature. When I did turn, he was standing a few steps inside, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, expression unreadable but alert. "Oh," he said, as if coincidence was still possible. "Didn't think anyone else was here." "Yeah," I replied, stupidly. "Same." The word same lingered between us, heavier than it should have been. Neither of us moved to leave. The silence wasn't awkward, it was loaded, stretched thin by everything unsaid. Lucas leaned back against the counter, maintaining a careful distance that somehow emphasized closeness. "You left pretty fast earlier," he said. "I had things to do." "So did I," he answered, then paused. "Still do." His honesty caught me off guard. I nodded, unsure what agreement I was offering. The mirror reflected us side by side, two figures sharing space but avoiding direct alignment, like we were both afraid of what might happen if we stood too close. "I didn't mean to make things weird," Lucas added, his voice low. "If I did." "You didn't," I said, then hesitated. "At least, I don't think so." That earned a small smile, soft, cautious. "Good." The air felt thicker, as though the room were listening. I became acutely aware of my breathing, of how still Lucas was standing, of the fact that leaving would require a decision I wasn't ready to make. This wasn't flirtation in the usual sense. It was something quieter and more unsettling. "I have a boyfriend," I said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if they'd been waiting for permission. Lucas didn't look surprised. If anything, he seemed relieved by the clarity. "I figured," he said. "The way you talk about him. Or don't." That stung because it was true. "I shouldn't be here," I continued, more to myself than to him. "No," Lucas agreed gently. "You probably shouldn't." Yet neither of us moved. We stood there, separated by a few feet and an ocean of restraint. There was no touch, no crossing of lines that could be easily named, but the awareness between us was unmistakable. It lived in our eye contact, in the careful way our words avoided certain truths while circling others. "I just wanted to know," Lucas said after a moment, "if this was only in my head." I swallowed. The answer mattered more than I wanted it to. "It's not," I admitted. The confession landed quietly, without drama, but its impact was undeniable. Lucas exhaled, as if releasing something he'd been holding onto for weeks. For a brief, dangerous second, it felt like relief outweighed fear. Then reality returned. I stepped back, creating space where none had existed. "That's all I can say," I added quickly. "I don't want to hurt anyone." Lucas nodded, accepting the boundary without resentment. "Neither do I."
The moment broke. Not shattered, just carefully folded away. Lucas straightened, glancing toward the door. "I'll see you in class," he said. "Yeah," I replied. "See you." He left first, the door closing softly behind him. I remained where I was, heart pounding, mind racing. Nothing had happened, and yet everything felt different. I knew, with a certainty that unsettled me, that what we'd shared couldn't be undone. As I finally turned to leave, I understood that the hardest part wouldn't be resisting temptation. It would be living with the knowledge that temptation now knew my name.
After that afternoon, my life divided itself into before and after, though nothing visible marked the change. Classes continued. Assignments piled up. Mark still kissed me goodbye in the mornings and asked about my day at night. On the surface, everything remained intact. Underneath, I carried a secret that refused to stay quiet. I replayed the bathroom encounter more often than I wanted to admit, not for what had happened, but for what hadn't. The restraint lingered like a held breath. It followed me into lectures, into bed, into conversations with Mark where my responses arrived a second too late. Mark noticed. "You're distracted again," he said one evening as we ate dinner in silence broken only by clinking cutlery. "Did something happen?" I shook my head, hating how easily the lie formed. "Just stressed." He studied me, concern softening his features. "You know you can talk to me." I did know. That was the problem. Talking would mean admitting that I was standing on unstable ground, that my loyalty was being tested by nothing more than proximity and possibility. Instead, I nodded and changed the subject, watching something unspoken settle between us. Lucas didn't disappear after that day. He didn't pursue me either. If anything, his restraint mirrored mine. We exchanged polite nods in class, brief comments about readings, nothing that could be mistaken for intimacy. And yet, every interaction felt heavier, charged by the knowledge we shared. Then came the messages. The first was harmless. Did you understand today's assignment? I answered professionally. Yeah, I think so. Professor loves ambiguity. Figures, Lucas replied. He probably enjoys watching us suffer. It should have ended there. Instead, the conversation stretched, cautiously at first, then with growing ease. We talked about classes, about music, about the strange pressure of being surrounded by people while feeling unseen. Lucas had a way of asking questions that invited honesty without demanding it. I told myself this wasn't betrayal. We weren't flirting. We weren't meeting in secret. We were just talking. That justification wore thin quickly. At night, lying beside Mark, I found myself checking my phone when it buzzed, my pulse quickening in a way that had nothing to do with friendship. I hated myself for the comparison that crept in uninvited, for noticing how Lucas listened, how present he seemed, how light the conversations felt. Guilt became a constant companion, dull but persistent. I compensated by being extra attentive to Mark, asking about his day, initiating plans I didn't fully enjoy. The effort felt performative, like I was trying to prove something to myself rather than to him. One afternoon, Mark reached for my hand while we walked back to the apartment. I let him, but the gesture stirred an ache instead of comfort. You're pulling away, he said quietly. I'm right here, I answered. He stopped walking, forcing me to face him. Physically, yes, but something's off. I wanted to tell him then. I wanted to confess the truth, that I was struggling, that I had let curiosity blur into connection. But the fear of what honesty might dismantle held me still. I shook my head again, a denial that felt increasingly fragile. I love you, Mark said, not as reassurance but as fact. The words settled heavily in my chest. I love you too, I replied, meaning it and wondering if love was supposed to feel this complicated. Later that evening, a message from Lucas appeared on my screen. Can we talk? Not about class. I stared at the words longer than necessary. My thumb hovered, hesitating between caution and relief. Maybe, I typed back. I don't want to make things harder than they already are. Neither do I, Lucas replied. But pretending nothing changed feels dishonest. He was right. That was what frightened me most. I set the phone down, heart racing, aware that avoidance was no longer a solution. The balance I'd been trying to maintain, between loyalty and longing, was beginning to tip. And as I lay awake beside Mark, I realized that indecision itself had become a choice, one that would soon demand an answer I couldn't postpone much longer. I met Lucas 2 days later in a quiet courtyard behind the library, a place students passed through without lingering. It felt appropriate, public enough to prevent recklessness, private enough to allow honesty. When he arrived, he didn't smile. Neither did I. I didn't want to do this over text, he said. I'm glad you didn't, I replied. We stood facing each other, the space between us deliberate. Whatever had sparked between us had matured into something heavier, something that demanded definition. Lucas spoke first, his voice steady but careful. I like you, he said. Not in a way that ignores reality. In a way that respects it. But I can't pretend this is nothing. I nodded. Neither can I. The admission felt like stepping onto solid ground after weeks of imbalance. I told him about Mark, not just that he existed, but that he mattered. That I was torn not because something was missing, but because something unexpected had appeared. I don't want to be the reason you hurt someone, Lucas said. You're not, I answered. I am, or I will be, if I don't stop pretending this isn't my responsibility. Lucas studied me, searching for certainty I was still building. Then what happens now? I took a breath. I choose honesty, even if it costs me. He nodded once, accepting the answer without pushing for more. There was no dramatic goodbye, no lingering look meant to undermine resolve. Just a quiet understanding that timing, not feeling, had placed us on opposite sides of a line. That evening, I told Mark the truth. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to be real. I told him I had let myself grow close to someone else. That nothing physical had happened, but something emotional had shifted, and I hadn't stopped it soon enough. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, silence filled the room. So, Mark said finally, you didn't cheat. But you were on your way. Yes. The word hung between us, stark and unforgiving. I wish you'd talked to me sooner, he said. There was no anger in his voice, only disappointment. I wish you'd trusted me with your doubts. So do I replied. We talked for hours after that, not arguing, not accusing, just unraveling what had tightened over time. Mark admitted he'd felt the distance too, had assumed it was temporary, manageable. We both realized how easily comfort had turned into complacency. In the end, there was no dramatic breakup. Just a quiet agreement to step back, to reassess whether staying together out of habit would only deepen resentment. Love, we learned too late, required attention as much as affection. When Mark went to stay with a friend for a while, the apartment felt larger and emptier. I sat alone, phone face down on the table, resisting the urge to reach out to Lucas for solace. Choosing honesty didn't mean choosing escape. Days passed. The ache softened into something reflective. I saw Lucas in class once more, our exchange limited to a nod that held more respect than regret. What we'd shared had been real, but it hadn't been allowed to become reckless. I didn't know what would happen next, whether Mark and I would find our way back, or whether Lucas and I would cross paths again under different circumstances. What I did know was this: I had learned how quietly lines could blur, how infidelity could begin not with touch, but with attention. Standing at that threshold had changed me. And as uncertain as the future felt, it also felt honest, for the first time in a long while.